The cafeteria on Orbital Station Callius smelled of warm bread and spiced broth. But she sat alone in the far corner, pretending not to breathe too deeply. Her body was small, fragile, wrapped in a worn gray cloak that hung loosely from her shoulders. Her eyes, an unusual shade of silver, followed every tray that passed by. Steam rose from plates piled with food. The smell made her chest ache. She had not eaten in 3 days. She had learned to sit still so her hunger would hurt less. The other aliens, tall broad creatures with scaled hides, smooth insect shells, or heavy fur, walked past without a second glance. Some looked at her and quickly looked away. A few sneered, muttering things in languages she only half understood. She kept her head down. She knew better than to ask for help. The station had rules. Food was for workers, merchants, soldiers, and registered travelers. Refugees with no credits, no job, and no political sponsor received only 1 ration pack every 10 days. That pack had been gone a long time. A group of heavy-set reptilian traders walked by, laughing loudly. One of them looked in her direction and said something to his friends that made them laugh harder. She didn't need a translation to know it was cruel. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table. She could feel herself shaking. At another table, a group of humans sat together. She had seen them before: freighter crews, engineers, dock workers. They were loud, but not in the same way as the traders. They laughed with each other, not at others. Still, she didn't think they would help. No one ever did, until one of them noticed her. He was tall for a human, with dark hair and a weathered face. His uniform was plain, but the way he carried. Himself said he had once worn something with more authority. He was eating slowly, listening to the conversation at his table, when his eyes drifted toward the far corner. He froze for a moment, then turned back to his friends. But he didn't look away for long. She realized he had seen her watching the bread on his plate. Her heart raced. She looked down quickly, pulling the hood of her cloak lower. Maybe he would ignore her. That would be better. Instead, the sound of his chair scraping the floor made her look up again. He stood, picking up his tray, and began walking toward her. Her first instinct was to get up and leave. But her legs felt too weak, and her stomach cramped hard. She stayed still, gripping the table as his shadow fell across her. "Hey," he said, his voice low, steady. "You eaten today?" She shook her head without thinking, then looked away. Talking to strangers on the station was dangerous. Talking to humans was worse. Humans were unpredictable. He set his tray on the table. "Mind if I sit?" She didn't answer, but he sat anyway. He slid the plate toward her. Steam curled from a thick bowl of soup and a slab of bread. "Eat," he said. She stared at the food. This had to be a trick. No one gave food away here. If someone did, it was because they wanted something in return, something she could not give. Her silence didn't seem to bother him. "Can eat or you can keep staring at it. But if you wait too long, I'll eat it myself." He smiled faintly, but his eyes were serious. Her hands shook as she reached out. The bread was warm, soft. She tore off a piece and took a bite so small it barely counted. Still, the taste hit her like lightning. Her stomach growled loudly, and her eyes burned. She forced herself not to eat too fast. At a nearby table, someone hissed something in a harsh alien tongue. She recognized the word for traitor. The man glanced in their direction but didn't react. "Name's Elias," he said quietly. "Captain Elias Ward. You got a name?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Soren. That from your homeworld?" Nodded. He studied her for a moment. "You're not registered here, are you?" Her chest tightened. "No, that's why you're starving." He leaned back in his chair, his voice dropping. "You know, they'll keep doing this until you leave or die." She swallowed hard, saying nothing. "I've seen it before," he continued. "Refugees stuck between borders. No one wants to help because it's easier to look away." She stared at her soup, afraid of what he might say next. "You got family here?" Her spoon froze halfway to her mouth. "No," he didn't press. Instead, he pulled his tray closer and began eating from a smaller plate he had kept for himself. "Well, you're eating now. That's what matters." Wanted to ask why he was helping, but the words wouldn't come. In her experience, good things usually came with a price. Across the cafeteria, the reptilian traders were still watching. One of them leaned toward another table and said something that made a group of insectoid workers glance sharply in their direction. Soren shifted. In her seat, "They're angry," she murmured. "They'll get over it," Elias said, though his tone carried less certainty than his words, but she could see the way his eyes scanned the room. He wasn't just being kind, he was calculating, watching for trouble, and trouble was coming. The sound of boots echoed from the far doorway station security. They moved in pairs, their armor reflecting the cafeteria lights. People straightened in their seats. Few left quickly, abandoning trays. The security guards weren't here for just a random inspection. Soren knew that look. They were hunting someone. Her fingers clenched around her spoon. "They're looking for me." Elias didn't move. "Eat." "You don't understand," she whispered urgently. "If they see me, they already saw you," he said. "And they saw me sit with you. So finish your food. Running now will make it worse." She wanted to argue, but her legs were too weak and the soup was too warm. She ate another spoonful, forcing herself not to look at the guards. They moved through the room, scanning tables. One of them spoke into a cum, eyes flicking toward her corner. Soren's heart pounded. She felt trapped, like the air itself was closing in. Elias finished his meal calmly, then leaned forward. "When they come over, don't speak. Let me talk." "Why?" she asked. "Because if you talk, they'll hear your accent. They'll know you're not registered." She nodded, barely breathing. The guards stopped at their table. "Captain Ward," one of them said, their voice cold. "What's your business with this individual?" Elias leaned back, crossing his arms. "Having lunch." "Still. Legal, right?" The guard's visor tilted toward Soren. "She is not authorized to be here. She's my guest. That makes you responsible for her." "Fine," Elias said, his voice sharp now. "Then I'm responsible, problem." The guard hesitated. Something about Elias's tone, his confidence, made them step back. "Keep her out of trouble," they muttered, then turned away. When they were gone, Soren let out the breath she'd been holding. "You didn't have to do that." She whispered. "Yes," Elias said, standing. "I did. Come on." "Where?" "To get you out of here before they change their minds." She stared at him, unsure if this was the first step toward safety or something far worse. But when he started walking, she stood and followed all around. The station hummed with the sound of machines and distant voices. Somewhere in the shadows, someone was watching. She could feel it, and she had no idea why this human had decided to help her, or what it would cost them both. Because on orbital station Callias, kindness was never free steam. Curled from the bowl as Soren took another trembling spoonful, her eyes flicking to the door every few seconds. She hadn't expected the human to keep his word. But the food was still in front of her, and he hadn't asked for anything in return. That was the most suspicious part. Captain Elias Ward sat across from her, leaning back in his chair like he had all the time in the galaxy. He wasn't eating anymore. He was just watching her. It made her uneasy. "You eat like you're expecting someone to take it away," he said quietly. She didn't answer. She didn't want to tell him that this had happened before on another station, another world where the first kindness had turned out to be a trap. "Where are you staying?" he asked. She hesitated, then muttered, "Cargo Bay, Deck 16. His eyebrows rose slightly. "That's freezing at night," she shrugged. "Better than the refugee dorms." He didn't ask why. Maybe he already guessed. Too many eyes, too many people asking questions she couldn't answer. A shadow moved in. The corner of the cafeteria? Soren noticed at first a tall, thin figure lingering by the recycling bins. It wasn't one of the traders. It wasn't security either. She didn't recognize the species, but the way it was watching them made her grip the edge of the table. Elias noticed her glance and followed it. His expression didn't change, but his posture shifted. "Friend of yours?" She shook her head quickly. The figure turned and walked away, vanishing into the corridor. Elias stood up suddenly. We're leaving. She froze. Why? Because someone just decided we're worth noticing, he said, his voice calm but clipped. And on a station like this, that's rarely good news. She almost didn't follow him, but the thought of staying alone in the cafeteria was worse. She stood, pulling her hood low, and walked beside him, toward the exit. As they stepped into the corridor, she caught sight of the figure again far ahead this time, moving fast. Whoever it was, they weren't done watching, and in the pit of her stomach, Soren knew this was only the beginning. Captain Elias Ward moved with purpose through the narrow corridors of Orbital Station Callias. But his pace wasn't hurried. Hurrying drew attention, and attention was dangerous when someone had already marked you. Soren kept close behind him. Her hood pulled low, the frayed edges of her cloak brushing the floor. She hated that she had to half-jog to match his stride. Every sound, the clang of boots on metal, the hiss of a door opening made her flinch. They turned down a quieter passage, away from the main traffic lanes. The air was colder here, and the lights flickered with the faint, irregular pulse of a faulty power conduit. Elias slowed, listening. "You hear that?" he murmured. She strained her ears. At first nothing, then the faint scrape of something metal dragging across the floor. Behind them, it wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. "They're following us," she whispered. "Yeah." He didn't sound surprised. "But they're not rushing. Means they want to see where we go." They reached a service hatch. Elias tapped. A small keypad beside it, and the door slid open with a sigh. Inside, the maintenance tunnel was dim, lined with cables and coolant pipes. "Get in," he said. Soren hesitated. "Where does it go?" "Not important right now." His tone left. No room for argument. She stepped inside. The hatch closed behind them with a muted clang, cutting off the faint scrape of pursuit. The tunnel smelled faintly of oil and old metal. They walked in silence for several minutes, their footsteps muffled by the grated floor. Finally, Soren spoke. "Why are you helping me?" Elias glanced back at her. "'Cause I've seen what happens when people don't help. It's ugly, and I'm tired of watching." Before she could respond, something thin and metallic slipped under the gap of the hatch they had entered through. It was a small probno, bigger than a human hand skittering. Across the floor like an insect, Elias swore under his breath and drew a compact blaster from his belt. With a single sharp pulse, the probe sparked and collapsed, smoke curling from its shell. "They're not just following," he said grimly. "They're tracking." Her chest tightened. "Who are they?" "I was hoping you'd tell me," Elias replied. "Because someone went through a lot of trouble to make sure you stay hungry. We're dead." The air in the tunnel felt suddenly colder. And somewhere in the shadows, Soren knew those watching eyes hadn't given up. They were only getting closer. The glow from the crystal bathed the maintenance tunnel in pale blue light, soft but sharp enough to make Elias narrow his eyes. Soren clutched it in both hands, her fingers trembling, not just from fear, but from the weight of what she held. Elias had seen his share of strange tech in his time, but this wasn't standard. The crystal's surface shifted like liquid glass, its light pulsing faintly in time with her heartbeat. "What is that?" he asked, his voice low. She didn't answer right away. Her gaze darted toward the shadows at the far end of the tunnel, as if she expected someone to come bursting through at any moment. "It's proof," she said finally, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Proof of what?" Her silver eyes lifted to his. "That my people didn't start the war." Ilias's jaw tightened. He remembered the broadcast's grainy footage of explosions. Burned cities, alien soldiers marching. The official reports had been clear. Her species had fired the first shots, and the retaliation had been necessary. Billions dead. Planets stripped bare. If this crystal gets to the right people, she continued, it will show who really caused it. It will show everything. He studied her face. Oh. She wasn't lying, at least, not in the way most did. Her fear was too raw, her voice too brittle. "Why didn't you give it to someone already?" he asked. "I tried," she said quickly. "Before I got here, but every person I trusted disappeared. Some were arrested, some were found later." Her voice cracked on the last word. Elias leaned back against the wall, running a hand over his face. And now, whoever's been following us knows you have it. She nodded. The sound of heavy boots echoed faintly from the tunnel they'd come from. Elias tensed, motioning for her to step behind him. This way, he said, moving quickly toward a junction. They ducked into a side passage, just as a squad of armored soldiers entered the main tunnel. Their armor wasn't station security, it was darker, with an emblem Elias didn't recognize. The soldiers paused near the burnt-out probe, one of them scanning it with a handheld device. They're hunting you, Elias murmured. And they're not going to stop until they get that crystal. Soren's grip on the glowing shard tightened. Then we can't let them. For a moment, the pale light flickered between them, casting their shadows long against the walls. Elias knew two things. This crystal was dangerous, and so was keeping it. But handing it over? That would be worse. The docking level smelled faintly of ozone and machine oil. The air heavy with the hum of massive power couplings feeding the station's outer bays. Elias moved fast, guiding Soren through narrow service corridors rather than the main walkways. The fewer people who saw them, the better. She kept glancing over her shoulder. Every time she thought she heard footsteps, her pulse jumped. The crystal was hidden beneath her cloak now, but it felt heavier with each step. "Where are we going?" she whispered. "Somewhere with an engine," Elias said. He stopped at a maintenance door and tapped a quick sequence into the keypad. The door hissed open, revealing the dim interior of a cargo transfer tube. Beyond it lay a narrow bridge that led to a cluster of smaller docking berths. Halfway across, a voice called from the shadows ahead.
"You're late."
A man stepped. Into the light, a human in a grease-stained jacket. With a shock of white hair and an unlit cigar clenched between his teeth. Behind him, two more figures emerged, both armed. "Relax," Elias said. "She's with me." The white-haired man's eyes flicked to Soren. "That the package you were talking about?" Soren stiffened. "I'm not," Elias cut her off. "She's a person, and yes, she's who I need to get out of here." The man shrugged. "Fine by me. But nothing's free, Ward. You know the rules." "Pay," Elias said. "You'll pay double," the man replied. "Because the people looking for her aren't station cops. They've got deeper pockets and worse tempers." Before Elias could answer, a sharp metallic clank echoed from the far end of the bridge. Soren's breath caught armored figures. Were stepping into view, their helmets reflecting the dull overhead lights. The white-haired man swore under his breath. "You brought them to my berth?" "They followed us," Elias said flatly. "You still want double?" One of the armed figures with the mantle, thin, with cybernetic arms, stepped forward. "Boss, if we don't move now, they'll cut us off." The man hesitated only a second before snapping. "Get the ship hot. We leave in 5. Elias grabbed Soren's arm, pulling her toward the berth. Behind them, the boots on the bridge grew louder. It's faster. The docking bay doors loomed ahead wide, reinforced, half open to reveal the battered hull of a small freighter. Its engines coughed to life with a deep, vibrating growl. Soren's legs burned as she ran up the boarding ramp. Elias was right behind her, glancing back only once long enough to see the first armored soldier raise a rifle. A shot cracked through the air, striking the ramp just behind Ilias's heel. He shoved Soren inside and slammed the hatch shut. The ship jolted as the engines roared, lifting off the berth floor. In the cockpit, alarms were already screaming. Through the small forward viewport, Soren caught one last glimpse of the soldiers. In the docking, be still advancing, weapons ready before the freighter swung toward the open void of space. But even as the stars began to spread out before them, she knew this wasn't escape. It was only a head start. The freighter's interior rattled with every burst from its aging thrusters, the walls groaning as if the ship itself disliked the sudden sprint into open space. Soren sat strapped into a crash seat in the narrow corridor just behind the cockpit, her cloak wrapped tight around her. The crystal pressed against her ribs like a cold heartbeat. Elias stood in the doorway, watching the two crew members up front work the controls. The pilota woman, with copper skin and a scar across her jock, put one hand steady on the throttle, the other flicking between switches. The co-pilot's eyes darted across the scanners. the glow from the screen making his face pale. "They're still on us," the co-pilot said. "Fast ships? Military spec? Course change?" Elias asked. "Won't matter," the pilot replied. "They've got better engines." Soren leaned forward slightly. "Then they'll catch us. Not if we make a choice first," the pilot said without looking back. Elise's jaw tightened. "What kind of choice?" The co-pilot glanced over his shoulder. "Lose the cargo. Lose her." The words hit Soren like a slap. Elias stepped further into the cockpit, his voice suddenly low and dangerous. "Not happening." "You're not the one flying," the pilot said, meeting his glare for just a second. "You know what those ships mean? If they catch us, we all die. She's not worth the entire crew." Soren's throat felt dry. She wanted to speak, to say she'd go quietly if it meant they'd live. But Elias's next words froze her in place. "She's worth the risk," he said. "More than you realize." The co-pilot swore under his breath. "You don't get it? If we're boarded, they'll tear the ship apart, whatever she's carrying." "Is the reason they're chasing us?" Elias cut in. "If we destroy it, maybe they back off." Soren's chest tightened. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "If they catch us, don't fight for me. Destroy the crystal. Promise me." Elias turned to her, eyes sharp. "Not going to happen." Before she could argue, the ship jolted violently. One of the pursuing vessels had fired a warning shot across their bow. "They're telling us to stop," the co-pilot said grimly. The pilot's hands hovered over the throttle. "Last chance, Ward. Do we give her up, or do we fight?" Elias didn't hesitate. "We fight." The pilot cursed and slammed the throttle forward. The freighter groaned, engines screaming as it shot toward the debris field of an ancient battle site ahead. Broken holes, shattered weapons platforms, and clouds of jagged metal drifting silently in the void. Soren gripped the crash seat arms so tightly her knuckles hurt. The debris would hide them from scanners, or tear the ship apart. And behind them, the hunters were still coming. The debris field loomed like the bones of dead giants. Shattered ships, drifting in slow, endless silence. The freighter weaved through the wreckage, metal shards scraping against its hull with a shrill nails and glass sound. Soren's breath came shallow, her eyes fixed on the glowing lines of the crystal, still hidden under her cloak. Every second they stayed in here, the risk of being torn open by jagged hull fragments grew but outside. The hunters waited. In the cockpit, the pilot's hands danced over the controls, pushing the ship between gaps no wider than a corridor. "We can't keep this up forever," she muttered. Elias stood behind her, his stance steady despite the ship's jolts. "We don't have to. Just long enough to get a signal out." The co-pilot spun around. "You're insane if you broadcast. In here, they'll trace it instantly. They'll trace us whether we send it or not," Elias said, his voice hard. "But if the truth gets out, they won't be able to hide this anymore." Soren looked up at him. "You mean the crystal?" He nodded. "Give it to me." For a moment she held it tighter, afraid that once it left her hands, the truth would disappear with it. But then she saw the way he looked at her, not pity, not doubt, but certainty, and she placed it in his palm. The crystal's glow flared as it touched his skin, projecting faint streams of light that swirled like smoke. Elias carried it to the COM panel, sliding it into a small slot. The screens flickered, then filled with shifting images, battle footage. Intercepted orders, records that contradicted every official story. The pilot's eyes widened. "Is this real?" "It's real," Elias said. He hit the transmit key. A sharp tone filled the cabin as the signal burst out across every open frequency in the sector. The data poured into the void, unstoppable now. Almost immediately, alarms blared. The pursuing ships had found them again. "They're moving in fast," the co-pilot warned. Elias turned to Soren. "Stay behind me." The freighter burst from the debris field into open space, its engines straining. The hunters were closing, but now their coms were alive with chaos. Voices shouted over one another, demanding answers, calling for confirmation of the broadcast. The pilot glanced at her scanners. "They're breaking off. Orders must have changed." Soren didn't dare believe it until the ships turned away. shrinking into the dark. By the time they docked at a neutral station, the crystal was going to burn out from the transmission. But the truth was everywhere now. Hours later, Soren sat at a table in a small, quiet cafeteria, the same warm bread, the same steaming soup. Across from her, Elias ate in silence. The other patrons stared, whispering, but no one came closer. Soren lifted her spoon, meeting his eyes. "Why did you help me?" Elias smiled faintly. "Because no one eats alone." For the first time since the war began, she believed it.